The MGM rehearsal studio sat nearly vacant, housing only two figures and an escalating hostility that permeated the space like thick fog. It was early spring 1960, and Bells Are Ringing had been in production for roughly 3 weeks. In this film, Dean Martin starred as a romantic lead opposite Judy Holliday, portraying a writer who becomes romantically involved with a receptionist at an answering service. The film incorporated some choreography, not extensively, but meaningfully. Fred Astaire served unofficially as a choreographic advisor, assisting director Vincente Minnelli as a personal favor. Fred Astaire had reached 60 and invested 5.5 decades pursuing an uncompromising standard. Every movement, every gesture, every head movement required flawlessness. Individual dance numbers consumed weeks of his time. He destroyed countless shoes developing sequences viewers would witness for mere moments. For Fred, choreography transcended mere performance. It represented a spiritual pursuit. And Dean Martin represented a violation of this sacred principle. Once more, Fred commanded, his tone carrying repressed exasperation. From the beginning, Dean exhaled, ran fingers through his hair, and repositioned himself. The choreography posed no significant challenge, merely a basic soft shoe routine accompanying a romantic moment. Any competent dancer would have absorbed it within hours. Dean had spent 5 days on the movements, yet mastery eluded him. The pianist began playing. Dean executed the steps. Satisfactory, adequate, sufficient for a non-dancing actor in a romantic film. He reached his positions. He maintained the beat. He remained upright. However, Fred's countenance darkened progressively. "Stop," Fred commanded, gesturing to the musician. The sound ceased. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" Dean halted, his face remaining composed, serene. "What troubles you now?" "What troubles me?" "Everything." "Dean, everything remains problematic." Fred approached, his refined posture accentuating his height. "Your footwork lacks energy. Your arm movements appear careless. You're not engaging genuinely with the movements. You're merely reproducing them mechanically. I'm hitting my marks." Mark hitting isn't authentic dancing. A chimpanzee could hit marks. Fred's volume intensified. Dancing demands precision. Dancing requires authentic commitment. Dancing involves making viewers perceive each movement as intentional, calculated, purposefully executed precisely when intended. Dean shrugged. "Appears adequate to me." "Adequate." Fred pronounced the term with contempt. "Mediocrity is unacceptable. Mediocrity represents an affront to profession. Fred, this constitutes a romantic comedy. Audiences aren't attending specifically for my dancing. They're coming to witness Judy and me experience romance. The choreography merely what? Just background material. Just scenes to endure until the narrative resumes." Fred experienced genuine fury now, his legendary composure fracturing. Every cinematic instant carries weight, every single moment. Should you underperform during choreography, you're shortchanging the audience. You're shortchanging the picture. You're shortchanging your own capabilities. Dean's expression stayed peaceful, nearly detached. This seemed to intensify Fred's anger exponentially. "Contribute to this discussion," Fred demanded. "Defend yourself. Demonstrate my error. You're not incorrect. You're simply—" Dean paused, hunting for appropriate terminology. "You're operating at a separate wavelength than I am." "What signifies that?" "It indicates we measure achievement differently." Dean relocated to a seat, retrieving a water glass. "You view choreography achieving 90% excellence and feel devastated regarding the missing 10%. I view choreography achieving 90% excellence and celebrate reaching 90%. That's the core issue. That represents the fundamental problem." Fred's voice carried sharp disdain. "Your entire professional existence rests upon acceptable performance, upon approximate results, upon delivering 70% while charming audiences through the remainder. Has this approach succeeded admirably?" Fred stepped nearer, his gaze intensifying. "You possess legitimate ability, Dean. Genuine skill. I've detected it momentarily when you release your restraint. However, your reluctance toward genuine exertion, toward authentic commitment, causes self-sabotage. You shelter behind your indifferent persona, permitting failure without trying as your defense mechanism. The utterance lingered. Dean's expression shifted momentarily before composure reasserted itself. That represents quite an examination, Dean acknowledged. It represents reality you recognize. Fred settled opposite, abruptly appearing fatigued. I've monitored your performance across decades, television, cinema. You're capable of considerably exceeding what you demonstrate. However, you've embraced stagnation, accepting mediocrity rather than pursuing greatness. This frustrates me immensely. Why does my professional trajectory concern you? Because giftedness remains uncommon. Authentic giftedness constitutes treasure. When someone possessing giftedness deliberately squanders it, Fred's voice trembled slightly. It constitutes betrayal. A betrayal toward everyone demonstrating twice the dedication with half the capacity who never succeeded. Dean remained silent momentarily, examining Fred with an unusually complicated expression. May I share something? Fred responded affirmatively. During my youth in Steubenville, there existed a dance instructor, Mrs. Caruso. She instructed Italian youngsters throughout the neighborhood. Tap, ballroom, whatever families could finance. Dean's voice turned introspective and distant. I studied with her across 3 years. I demonstrated considerable aptitude. More than considerable, truthfully. She consistently mentioned my inherent sense of rhythm, innate grace. She encouraged professional pursuit. Fred listened, astonished. He'd never heard Dean discuss origins regarding formal instruction. What transpired? I participated in a recital at 12. I perfected the choreography across months. Training continued until my feet blistered. I desired genuine perfection, matching your description. Dean paused, and I succeeded. Genuinely succeeded. The performance represented my finest work. Subsequently, I heard my father discussing another father. His voice tightened almost imperceptibly. He said, Dean's voice descended. That kid demonstrates talent, but he'll never achieve Hollywood success. No Steubenville Italian makes it big. He should apprentice a trade. Fred remained silent. He wasn't expressing malice. He conveyed realism that reflected 1930s reality. You remained within boundaries. You avoided excessive ambition. You apprenticed as a barber, steelworker, or car dealer. You didn't become Fred Astaire. Yet you succeeded in Hollywood. Indeed I did. Dean smiled slightly, though warmth disappeared. You realize my method? Through reduced effort. Through never displaying how desperately I desired it. Because non-effort prevents disappointment. Because indifference protects against harm. Fred sensed something shift internally. He'd approached this interaction prepared for instruction regarding discipline excellence. He hadn't anticipated this. Confession, suffering, glimpses beyond surfaces. That represents dreadful existence. Fred expressed quietly. Probably, yet it preserved my existence. Dean relocated toward windows, regarding the lot. You originated from Omaha, correct? Middle-class background. Vaudeville parents supporting your aspirations. Affirmative. Consequently, you discovered early that dedication received recognition, that sufficient work guaranteed achievement, that the world treated people fairly, I suppose. I discovered the opposite. Dean faced him directly. I learned the world disadvantages individuals resembling me, that regardless of dedication, someone perpetually dismisses me as insufficient, unsuitable, not belonging. Therefore, I ceased trying. I transformed non-trying into my professional identity, and it succeeded, not because I possess talent, though I do, but because I discovered pathways to success without vulnerability to disappointment. Fred remained silent, extending time. Processing this, he devoted his career to believing hard work, demanding excellence, sacrificing for your art, that someone might select different routes, not from indolence but from protective instinct, hadn't occurred to him. You're informing me, Fred articulated gradually, that your complete persona represents emotional armor? I'm communicating that every persona constitutes emotional armor, including yours. Dean's gaze connected with Fred's. You conceptualize your excellence pursuit as artistry. It addresses control. Perfection generates security. Choreography eliminates surprises. You experience equivalent terror, Fred. You merely camouflage it differently. The statement struck like physical impact. Fred desired denial, self-defense, explanation that excellence pursuit remained unadulterated, respectable, concentrating exclusively upon the work. However, something intervened. A glimmer of recognition, a whisper of validity. He contemplated unlimited training sessions, deteriorated shoes, sacrificed relationships, marriages struggling because he remained perpetually distracted, consciousness fixed upon subsequent routines, performances, perfectionism possibilities. Did that represent devotion or, matching Dean's suggestion, merely different concealment? That's not. Fred initiated, then hesitated. I've never entertained that perspective. Most individuals don't. It proves simpler accepting our selections as unadulterated, motivated by enthusiasm, conviction, whatever narratives we construct. Dean returned to seating. However, fundamentally, we're all apprehensive youngsters avoiding harm. You discovered security through perfection. I discovered security through indifference. Neither proves superior. They're simply distinct survival mechanisms. Fred remained motionless, his beliefs reorganizing quietly. He'd arrived at this training prepared fixing Dean Martin, activating his excellence recognition. Conversely, Dean reflected his internal reflection, revealing aspects Fred had resisted acknowledging. I owe you apology, Fred ultimately expressed. Dean raised eyebrows questioningly. For what reason? For presuming comprehension, assuming my philosophy proved exclusively correct, remaining so convinced regarding my righteousness that I overlook your individual nature. That demonstrates kindness, Fred. However, you weren't completely mistaken. Dean smiled subtly. I do settle. I do constrain myself. I do deliver 80% when 100% remain possible. The variance involves accepting my selections. You haven't achieved equivalent acceptance. What's your meaning? You continue pursuing something, attempting demonstrating something. Following 55 years of remarkable achievement, you remain within training studios, exhausting yourself, perpetually dissatisfied. Dean's voice maintained gentleness, avoiding criticism. What remains your objective, Fred? For whom are you demonstrating? The inquiry suspended. Fred opened his mouth, then closed it. He lacked response. Alternatively, he possessed multiple responses, none feeling authentic. I'm uncertain, he conceded. That's satisfactory. I lack equivalent certainty. I don't understand my concealment genuinely. I simply recognize I hide, and it sustained my security. Dean rose. Perhaps that suffices today. Adequate truth for us both. They remained within the training studio. Individuals who'd arrived as unknowns, departing as something different. Not companions precisely, but connected, united through conversation neither had foreseen. Shall we attempt the choreography again? Fred requested. Dean expressed laughter. Following everything, you desire my dancing? I desire observation. Fred relocated to center floor. I desire witnessing what transpires when you genuinely try. Not performing for cameras, not entertaining audiences, merely for this private moment. Dean hesitated. The proposition threatened. It requested what he'd structured his whole professional life avoiding: vulnerability, risking disappointment, commitment to outcomes. Yet something regarding the interaction had modified his internal landscape. A door had fractionally opened, and closure wasn't yet acceptable. Certainly, Dean responded. Once only, exclusively for ourselves. He positioned himself. The musician looked toward Fred, requesting permission. Fred indicated approval. The music commenced, and Dean Martin choreographed. Not satisfactorily, not adequately, not sufficient for non-professional dancers in romantic cinema. He choreographed with genuine dedication, with precise execution, with the inherent grace Mrs. Caruso had identified for decades earlier within a basement sanctuary in Steubenville. He reached positions. Yet additionally, he completely inhabited movements. He demonstrated presence Fred had never previously detected. Upon completion, Fred communicated pure amazement. That, Fred articulated carefully, that constitutes what I pursued across 5 days. Why hadn't you previously? Dean remained quiet momentarily. Because demonstrating dedication suggests acknowledging my emotional investment, and acknowledging my emotional investment permits accepting potential insufficiency. It's more comfortable to deliberately underperform than attempting wholeheartedly while falling inadequate. You didn't fall inadequate. That demonstrated excellence. It generated terror. Dean's expression barely exceeded whisper volume. Every single instant. Recognizing your observation, your assessment, comparing myself to yourself. Recognizing I'd never match Fred Astaire, regardless dedication. That remains inaccurate, and it matters regardless. Dean expressed a smile. I'm not pursuing Fred Astaire imitation. I'm pursuing Dean Martin becoming. And perhaps that represents sufficient. Perhaps sufficient proves satisfactory. Fred experienced unexpected emotion at his eyes. Unanticipated, unwanted, yet undeniable. Something within this instant had breached his protective barriers, his carefully maintained restrictions. May I communicate something? Fred requested. Obviously. I've invested existence pursuing perfection. Every presentation, every training session, every stage, every screen moment. I've sacrificed partnerships, well-being, tranquility, everything pursuing ideals perpetually retreating regardless proximity efforts. Dean nodded gradually. I recognize, and monitoring you presently, observing your dedication, subsequently acknowledging the result proved adequate. Fred's sound became unsteady. I comprehended I've never accomplished that. I've never permitted satisfaction, never permitted communicating this represents excellence without immediately considering improvement possibilities. That seems fatiguing. It constitutes maximum exhaustion. Fred wiped his eyes. I suspect perhaps you just educated me something I've invested 60 years declining understanding. What represents that? That perfection doesn't constitute purpose. Connection constitutes purpose. Existing within the present constitutes purpose. And occasionally sufficient proves exceeding sufficient. It's precisely appropriate. They remain within the training studio watching afternoon brightness disappear. Individuals commencing the experience as contradictions, terminating as reflections. The perfectionist, the settler. The dedicated professional, the inherently gifted performer. The individual pushing excessively, the individual reluctant attempting. Distinct philosophies, equivalent apprehension underneath. Can I pose a question? Dean requested. Absolutely. If you possess contemporary perspective, would you restructure everything? Would you permit yourself sufficient sometimes? Reduce pressure? Fred contemplated deliberately. The question warranted thorough response. I'm uncertain, he ultimately answered. My perfectionism generated my profession. Without it, I might never have accomplished my achievements. However, it additionally costs sacrifices impossible retrieving. Partnership duration, psychological peace, appreciating my personal accomplishments. So it's exchanging benefits. Everything requires exchanging benefits. Your philosophy, my philosophy, each carries disadvantages. The consideration involves which disadvantages you might manage. Fred paused. I believe I've sacrificed costs I didn't comprehend completely. You demonstrated that today. You didn't accomplish anything. I merely performed singular choreography. You accomplished considerably more. Fred extended his hand. Gratitude, Dean, for the conversation, for authenticity, for illustrating alternative survival pathways within this profession. Dean secured his hand. Gratitude for motivation, for rejecting my settling, for demanding effort when I opposed it. They departed the training studio simultaneously, moving toward golden California darkness. The workplace maintained silence. The majority of temporary performers had departed. Exclusively committed workers remained developing in remote sound stages. Equivalent timing tomorrow? Fred requested. Equivalent timing tomorrow. However, Fred, yes, perhaps perfection doesn't matter. Perhaps existence matters. Perhaps we merely need demonstrating presence. Fred expressed a grin, authentic, producing wrinkles beside his eyes. I'll attempt remembering that. That represents everyone's capability. Attempting. The production of bells Are Ringing progressed across 6 additional weeks. The The choreography generating considerable disagreement developed exquisitely, not matching Fred's perfectionist criteria, yet dynamic, participatory, unfiltered. Fred Astaire, Dean Martin never developed close companionship. Their professional spheres differed substantially. Personalities diverged considerably, yet they maintained reciprocal appreciation persisting throughout existence. By 1970, Fred participated in professional discussion addressing his profession. The interviewer questioned him regarding dancers he collaborated with throughout existence. The collaborators, protégés transferring to his professional sphere. Regarding Dean Martin, the interviewer proposed, "I comprehend you collaborated on Bells Are Ringing." Fred paused momentarily, a subdued expression decorating his mouth. "Dean Martin instructed me regarding something significant." He responded, "What remained that? That excellence permits multiple expressions. I invested my profession, believing perfection constituted singular purpose." Dean demonstrated that immediacy proves equivalent, possibly exceeding, that concentrating upon present moments, behaving authentically, permitting sufficient, that manifests distinctive excellence. That doesn't sound like typical Fred Astaire perspective. It represented something fresh. That's why it required acquisition. Fred paused. We're all imprisoned by our personal achievement somehow. We locate something productive and replicate it continuously, despite internal damage. Dean discovered methodology becoming successful without destroying himself. I'm uncertain I ever did. The interviewer pursued further questions, yet Fred resisted elaboration. Certain lessons felt excessively individual for general conversation. Fred Astaire passed in 1987 at age 88. His concluding dance occurred previously, yet he perpetually remained moving, perpetually performing, perpetually pursuing excellence characterizing his existence. Dean Martin exceeded him by 8 years, passing Christmas Day 1995. Subsequently, he'd mostly retreated, appreciating classic westerns within his residence, remembering professional experience delivering recognition, prosperity, and solitude persisting indefinitely. However, associates of both individuals reported something shifted subsequently to 1960. Fred became progressively less inflexible, increasingly permitting imperfection. Dean became progressively more participating, progressively willing attempting. Singular conversation, singular afternoon, singular moment of authenticity among individuals spending lifetimes concealing differently. It wasn't substantial, yet it remained adequate. And occasionally, matching Dean Martin's assertion, adequate represents exactly right. End of story.